Hello, everybody, and we're gonna have a duo stream today because I'm here with Castle, and everybody else is suitably late, like always, apart from last week. And we will be going into chapter 54, uh, Blood and Bones. So we'll put some flesh on the bones of this book. We'll go into the realm of the personal, although I do have the sense that we've been there all along in some sense. And um, I was diligently studying. Um, I encountered a lot of frustration with the way that Matthieu is phrasing things, the liberty that he's taking, all of that, and yeah, well, we'll get into that. But the topic of frustration is related to my intention. So there's like what is frustration? Well, frustration is the the keeping away of union of heaven and earth in some sense, right? It's not allowing things to land. Um, like it's having the spirit change course as a consequence of something, right? And I think you can uh, separate that in two types, right? Like one type is redeemable, um, and so it can maintain communion, right? So it's like a minor thing. It's just like a bump, a speed bump on the road, uh, which is fine. And then there's a bigger one where like everything stops, right? And the purpose of what's happening or the activity that you're participating in changes as a consequence. And this this type of frustration is because people are frustrated themselves, right? So there's something broken in them or not flowing in them that they then bring outside of them, and they impose that on what's happening, and that's we're going to get into that where you bring the microcosm inside of you out into the world as a mediator, and so yeah, like that can be frustrated, and yeah, like that's a big deal that can be frustrated. Like that's a massive deal, especially if we don't see it or if we don't know how to deal with it. Um, and also, this is then the personal side of that. Then that gets internalized in me as well, right? So I'm taking in the frustration of other people. Mark, you're leaking, and in the taking in of that frustration, like now I bring that back into the world as well, right? So it's like a contagion, and that frustration and that needs to be resolved, right? So this dynamic is what I want to attend to. Is like okay, and part of that is a consequence of framing, right? So I think we can cut it up in two parts, right? So one is like if things are not in the right frame, they can't become expressed correctly, right? They're frustrated in their expression, right? And then the other one I think is in harmony, right? So if the harmony is lost, the ability to cooperate, to come together, to unify is frustrated, right? And I think you can map these to the masculine and the feminine as well, right? Like so one is caring for the ground in in which things grow, and the other one is that they grow correctly and that they get informed correctly. So that's what I'm going to be attending to. Castle, you want to go next?
Sure. So yeah, so I think that before I kind of get into mine and I'll tie it into it. The frustration thing is really interesting because I think we're also seeing as always our intentions and everything get tied in whether we realize it or not into the book clubs, which is always good fun. And as we kind of saw here today, like the time zone change frustrated our book club and impacted our ability to commune at that level. And integrating that is kind of different depending on where somebody is at and that sort of thing. In fact, it's actually better for me, which ties into my like you actually I will potentially be sticking around for longer than usual because of the earlier time. Whereas, and that kind of leads me into my thing. So I have my subtitle here is placebo effect incarnate. So pretty much, the stuff that shouldn't work or that has absolutely no preparation tends to work out for me. I have a lot of very unusual strategies, which involve actually not planning things. And it's not just improvisation either. And a lot of people would heavily criticize or discourage it, but it seems to work a lot better than when I actually try to plan things. And so, because the placebo effect is more or less inexplicable, I'm not going to bother as much. It's also a little bit of an excuse for me to be lazy with my intention. But as I've done very little preparation aside from reading, I will try to embody the placebo effect and get the job done regardless. Gustavs, would you like to go next?
My intention for the week is just to get more deeply into the text, like think about it a bit. I think in a calm way, without expecting anything much. I'm really happy with how I think it was last week's intention was to get some clarity. I think that was last week, maybe a week before that, but I feel like I got that, and it was amazing. And I can't give any examples right off the bat, but I think I kind of had that throughout the week. I've been working with it, and it works. It works. Like the whole thing about the yeah. Anyway, um, that's me. You want to go, Mark?
Yeah. So, just continue to sort of see the way the text relates to your participation, intentional or unintentional, we'll say, right? And so enjoying and appreciating the patterns that emerge. And of course, I've read the book before, but actually, I'm not sure if I actually finished the very end, but I have read it before. And it's always nice to go back to a text like this and see, more stuff. So at this point that we're at in the book, a lot of things, are just, we'll say, getting deeper. I think is the best way to talk about it. A lot of things are just getting deeper, and so just appreciating that is sort of my intent. And Christopher, I guess it's good to see you. It's your turn.
Oh, I think you're muted. Right.
Uh-oh.
Oh, wow. Okay.
His mic is muted at the source somehow. That's not good. Hopefully he comes back with a fixed machine.
Yeah, and I hope that he's not frustrated by it.
By emergence, no less.
Solar frustration. Yeah, I guess we can start introducing the chapter a little bit. when it doesn't appear. Okay, I just have to click the thing first. So okay, we'll give Christopher a second chance. There we are.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Oh, yeah. I am, all kinds of running late and out of sorts this morning, so don't have much of a specific intention set. So, but I am here. I'll maybe intend to catch up or something, but
That's being good. That's a good basis. Well, let's head into the text. Yeah, so this is Castle's epic chapter, I think, which he didn't prepare for at all.
Yeah, don't try to shoehorn me into leading this one.
I am not gonna shoehorn you, although I have really little notes on this chapter. So yeah, please butt in, because like if things stand out to you, then we should talk about them. So the first thing that stood out to me is a mist went up from the earth. I actually didn't prepare this chapter. I started preparing from the other chapter, but I did read this part in the Bible, like yesterday, I think. So it is contrasted to the fact that there's no rain yet, and there's no man to plow the fields. Right. So it's like setting up the conditions where man is the mediation, and rain can be received by the fields or something. And so that's done through mist, right? And so like what is mist? Well, it's a vapor, it's scattered particles, it's like what's the right word? Not floating, but it's dust in the air, right? Or dust in the spirit. And so it's like potential, like it's the multiplicity that needs to condense into form. And so it's like, if we use Pageau's terms, it's like meaning trying to find something to adhere to. And that then gets equated with time, right? Which is in some sense it's transforming the matter into something, right? That so the meaning would inspire the identity of what it's adhering to, right? And that's then the space in which that happens, right? And so like the human is assigned as the space in which and the adherence happens. And then he's talking about earth and heaven as that which is mediated, I guess, and the time and space as the mediation, the things mediated between, I guess. Depending on how you flip it, because you can say it the other way in some sense. But that will come into the problem that I'm having with this framing. But I'll leave that for next chapter. So I guess we get to the diagram. Mark, you want to butt in?
Yeah, I mean, he's nice and explicit here, right? He says in chapter 15, Adam was described as a microcosm of creation, right? Which means his breath and flesh are miniature representations of heaven and earth. And then he's just doing the math. Like at some point, he's showing you like how this is laid out, like what this actually looks like. And I guess a lot of people are sort of maybe slowly poorly coming to the conclusion that how you relate things actually matters, right? Which science used to know and has denied through equality doctrine, and relating heaven and earth, time and space to the human components, we'll call them, for lack of a better term, is really what he's doing here. And then he's showing you how those individual representations or symbols come together to form more complex or deeper symbols. And that's really what this diagram is about, right? So heaven's relating to breath, bones relating to space, earth relating to flesh, time relating to blood. It's like, oh, right. And so we relate better to people as people, just for forever. That's where a lot of people don't like that. We call them scientists. They're practicing scientism though. But the fact of the matter is just that's how it is. And so the fact that he breaks it out that way and shows you how those symbols, I want to call it complexify, I think is the real point, and maybe the most important single point. Not that you should ever take a single point away from anything in these chapters, but that's the most important single point to me about this particular diagram. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. We're seeing the self-similar practicality of the world in the book, and the book's being as explicit about that as humanly possible. It would be my argument. That's so that I just wanted to make that super clear.
I think also that along with everything Mark said there, the diagrams here, like this one and all the other ones in the book, I think are like snapshots of a thing in motion. So, and that's how they all an important part of how they all relate to each other. So.
Yeah, I think when I look at this diagram, it reminds me a lot of just thinking like the anatomy of an arm or something like that, and thinking about the aspect of you have the blood and the bone, but then you also have the muscular tissue, and then you also have the veins that are wrapped around, and that those are also carrying oxygen through there. So you have the heaven kind of also passing through in the integration of that structure. And I just wanted to kind of call back to the image of the tetramorphic cherubim with respect to this diagram. So imagining sort of if you have the three that are going horizontally in heaven, those are sort of like the four faces. So you've got in the center bottom, you've got the face of the man, who is the full integration of all of the different things. On the right, you've got the lion, which is the extreme space solar image. You've got the time image on the left of the bull, and bull is also related to boil and swell and that sort of thing. So you can kind of think of waves and balloons and that sort of thing. And then you've got the heaven of the eagle, and then the earth is like the cherub is described as having like hooved feet, and so you have the kind of like the firm planting of that there. So I just wanted to kind of just relate that back to the image of those things, that you're also seeing that those things are also like a living representation of like this sort of diagram.
Yeah, the thing that is standing out to me is that all these things don't quite fit for me. Like they're all spilling over a little bit. So usually I adhere that to bad framing, right? Like it's or what Mark would say, like flattening. When things spill over, you probably reduced complexity into something simpler, and then it doesn't fit.
Yeah, I wish RJ were here. Sure do miss him participating in these. But I think one of the things he kept harping on early on was you have to understand what perspective these diagrams are coming from, because they're often coming from different actual perspectives. But another thing you have to understand about the diagrams is, and Christopher kind of touched on this earlier, right? They're slices. Mm-hmm. And as slices, they almost all of them not only represent motion, but also represent a layer of analysis, if we want to use sort of Peterson's terms, right? And so this layer of analysis is, again, it's just showing one layer up from us and how that relates down to us in terms of component parts to come together to form a complexity. Or another way to talk about complexity is to talk about unity. So these things, when combined, form the unity. And he's just breaking them out to show you how to get the complexity or the whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. So creation is greater than the sum of heaven, earth, time, and space. And so that's what he's demonstrating here, and the appropriate symbology, right? And the appropriate, what do I want to call it? Spatial sequence. Yes, spatial sequence, right? That's why it's laid out the way it is. And in that shows the combination. But there is, to Christopher's excellent earlier point, there is a motion in this, or really multiple motions, I guess. But it is in motion, and he has to slice time twice, right? Once to component parts, once to unity, right? So that's two slicings of time, and then show the motion with the arrows, right? And then represent all the parts broken out, right? That's one slice, and then the other slice is the complexity or the unity. And I think if you kind of understand the diagram in that way, and then understand that this relates to the human, that's why the heaven and the breath and the bones and the space and the flesh and the earth are all linked together, right? Then you start to train your mind to do, we'll call it appropriate linking, right? Or appropriate analogizing, however you want to sort of frame it. And that's when these things, quote, come together, quite literally, actually come together. And that to me is sort of, in some sense, this is the hardest thing to understand about the book, is that it's exemplifying the way to attach things together appropriately so that they fit and continue indefinitely and co-manifest meaning with everything else. And so it's showing you, I mean, one way to look at this is, how does creation co-manifest meaning? It's like, oh, okay, there it is. It's in the diagram. And I'm not saying you should just get it because I said that, right? But if you work with it long enough, especially if you progress through slowly enough, because sometimes people read things too quickly, you should come to that point by this point, you should be able to, it should be able to flow for you. I don't want to say click because it's not quite right. And just because, but the danger is, just because something flows for you doesn't mean it's right? Because so you have to be careful. But I kind of trust Mature, so I'm happy with. And I read the book. There ain't nothing wrong with it that I can tell. So that's for me, that's a ringing endorsement. If you know how easy it is for me to find flaws and point them out. So yeah, that's the important sort of perspective I wanted to add to this.
I think the word that you were looking for, Mark, is it comes alive for you, because I think that's literally what's trying to happen there. Go ahead.
I think when I look at this diagram as well, and maybe it's a little macabre, but I'm still thinking of this kind of aspect of dissection. It just, especially since we literally have the words blood and bone there. I'm imagining kind of, you see those things where you have the doctors studying on cadavers and that sort of thing, and if you take the analogy of an arm or something like that you could go and you could very well, separate the different aspects of the anatomy of that arm. And you could have them in separate containers and look at them specifically, but that would be yet another, not only dissection, but also very much a flattening. And then it would also be a very flat image if you were to just say, okay, well, in order to have an arm, you just slap all these things together, but it's important to kind of recognize the components. But then once you have all the components properly ordered together, and I really like the point about this, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, that once you have that, it's still another part of yet another whole, and that you can continue to kind of do that up the chain as well. So even that, just the idea of just here's a functioning arm. It's like that's still not sufficient, and also like what does that mean? Like it's structurally intact, but also like is it actually being used or anything like that? And then at that rate, you could continue scaling up.
Yeah, you also Castle, you gave me quite an insight. So if you want to sort of understand, look, it's obviously and it's not meant to be complete, so it's vastly incomplete, but also fascinating. Sort of I don't want to call it pop culture, but cultural reference. You can watch the movie Hellraiser. Now, I happen to absolutely adore the movie Hellraiser for so many reasons. They would be hard to list. The sequels are not anywhere near as good, but the concepts in that movie are amazing. And one of the concepts in the movie is um, the the guy is trapped, and the way he gets untrapped is he needs blood. And so the woman kills people to give him the blood, and he soaks up the blood, and that recreates his body. Oh, slowly, even I think. So at one point, he's got no skin. Right? It's kind of gruesome. To talk about macabre, Castle. See, one little word, and you set me off. But it's actually a good it's actually a good representation of adding blood and the bones and the flesh coming later, right? And also the I don't know what you would call it there, probably the soul or something, right, is there and able to communicate after a fashion, right? So the unity is already there. It just needs to be given blood, bones, and flesh, right? By giving it blood, which would be time. Also, which is just fascinating that you can't, in some sense, you can't escape the symbolism. So you write this cool horror movie full of really interesting concepts, as far as I can tell, by the way, none of which are actually incorrect, or I don't mean incorrect as in they're an accurate and precise representation of something. We'll say ethereal, but they're not incorrect in their structure and interactions, right? The relationships are certainly intact. Even we'll say their version of hell, which of course I find that is just mind-blowingly awesome. Also, a Western Buddhism corruption of actual Anglo-Catholic thought, but such a good one that I'll like totally allow it. So you can see that blood creating the bones and the flesh, right? Because the breath was already there or something, right? And how it that pattern is inescapable. Even when you write a crazy cult horror movie classic like Hellraiser, these symbols are still there, and and that's what makes the movie good, right? The thing that makes the movie good, or always made the movie good, especially for me, was, whoa, this is really close, like and if you're just swapping around, we'll say the ill-begotten conceptions of hell or something, but you're leaving all the other, we'll say, symbolic relationships intact in we'll call them a legal fashion, just for shorthand. You can do interesting things, but also you kind of have to, and that sort of relationship where you can't sort of break the pattern without destroying the story is everywhere. And I could go on with examples, but they're not relevant to this chapter. But Hellraiser actually is. And not that I necessarily recommend the movie, but also it is a fantastic movie in my opinion.
So I think, yeah, I don't know how to phrase it exactly, but you can see like that the center image is like kind of introducing like a three-dimensional component, right, with the winding. So I know space is not not a physical space, but if you map it like it uh, uh, a map, just a map of a territory, and then you raise that up, right? So you make it into a miniature maquette of whatever thing you're trying to envision. Now life can happen on it, right? Like life can't happen on a map, but like if you have like the houses there, and like you can simulate life, right? And like the only way to actually have life there is obviously to have living things populate that arena. But inflating it, right, and in the inflation, creating the space for movement to happen, right, or for movement to contrast itself against, right? So it's like you have the house, and then something can be in the house or outside of the house, and in the house there's certain qualities that are not outside of the house, which is not something you would have on a map, for example, right? Like, because that would just be a description of a house versus description of not a house. So the coming together, and this was also the thing that I was reading in Genesis 1, right? Like, so when the firmament gets separated, right? Like, now you get it, you create a space for something new, a new dynamic, right? And I think the new dynamic also is somewhat explanatory of the fractal nature, right? Because that new dynamic allows for, let's just say, a different game, or the same game at a different level, whatever you how you want to phrase that. And we'll get into that later, because there's a mediation between these layers, right? So they come together in certain manners, and I think that's maybe the most important part. Is like, okay, like how do we mediate? like what's the mediation between these layers, and what role do we play within that?
Something that came to mind as you were talking about that, actually, with respect to space, was you mentioned the word territory. And so I started looking at the etymology of that, and I found that the word ters, which in territory means to dry, and it's the same word as in metatarsal, which is like related to the sole of the foot. So you have, and so it's like a flat space, or a place specifically for drying or something like that. So I just wanted to kind of mention this aspect of territory being related to an actual like physical dry place as well.
Okay, and then we want to connect the dry place to something that's established, right? So something that is known for what it is. I think I can hand this page to you, Cass. Can I?
In just a second, hang on.
Okay.
Let me turn on my power here.
So the thing that I have highlighted is this idea of bloodletting and bone setting. It's at the center of the page. These symbols represent a healthy individual, the powers of ancient healers, bloodletting and bone setting. And thinking about it in that manner, right? It's like, okay, like what are the bones that you have for whatever you're like? What's the framework, right? Like what is the skeleton? Because the bones come together in a skeleton, right? That you hang yourself on, right? It's how you rest in some sense. Like it holds you up independent of you needing to apply force. And then the bloodletting is like, okay, so there's a mediative quality, bloodletting or blood transfusion, because like that was, I think, the thing Mark was like, if you have too little blood, you need more. But if you have too much blood, or it's flowing too quick or whatever, right? Like there's all of these problems that arise, and yeah, like one of the things is like, okay, like these frames, like they give intelligibility, right? Like they allow you to understand aspects of things that you're going through, and that allows you to inform your actions as well, like if you see some things.
I'm thinking, as I'm kind of looking at this, like a lot of stuff that I thought about but didn't actually take the time to write down came back to mind. And I was thinking about this thing where I recently, like on the communal scale, this idea of like, oh, you need new blood in this place or something. Like I heard that recently, actually. I joined an organization and there's a lot of like very old guys, like they're all in their 60s and 70s. And you have these, and they're leaders. And so you have the pillars of this place. They're, they're like the bones of the thing, and they're also quite old. And then you have, and they're actually talking about, oh, we need to recruit younger people to revivify the organization because everyone's in their 60s and 70s, and so they specifically say the words, we need new blood in the place. And then thinking about this thing where, and I'm not going to completely skip over the other stuff, but just a reference to something lower on this page about the bloodletting aspect for as like a medical practice, that even though that's been discontinued as a mainstay medical practice, it's officially discontinued, but people still recommend all the time, oh, you should go donate blood. And then you actually find out that by reducing the amount of this revivifying liquid, you actually, like a lot of people find more stable health, a placebo effect, if you will, as a result of doing that. There's a little bit of a loss of, I guess, what would you say, like attentiveness or something like that? Like you're less likely to be the greatest driver in the world if you just donated blood, for example. And you also require a little bit of stability. They usually say to eat right after that. But a lot of people have actually talked about how they regularly donate blood at, like monthly intervals or something like that. And not only is that a good way of really revivifying the medical system, and it's considered actually as like a morally upright thing to do. But those people generally claim that it contributes to their good health. Like and also you're not allowed to donate blood if you're sick. So that's an interesting aspect of like, well, you have to be stable in order to donate your additional blood, and then you wouldn't you know it, you continue being healthy, and it's like whether or not that had to do with the fact that you donated or not, there's something there.
I think it's kind of like fasting, right? It's like you're removing something from your natural order,
Yeah.
and then you have to adjust to that, right? And so you're creating the contrast and the flexibility and the necessity to be able to deal with that, right? Because now you have to attune to the fact that you're challenged.
Yeah, there's an aspect of fasting for sure, that especially like prolonged fasting, where if you go into that mode, you're no longer, the amount of tasks that your system needs to address at once is reduced because it's no longer worrying about digesting and redistributing the nutrients and all these things. So a lot of times, like there have been people who claim that they were diagnosed with cancer or something like that, and they'll go on some of these super long fasts. Like you could do like vitamins and all these different things, and if you're really careful about it, and you get like huge amounts of potassium in you, and you don't let yourself get dehydrated. Some of these people will go sometimes even like a month or something like that without eating any solid food, and then they wind up finding out that their stuff went into remission or something like that. And it's just like, just because they've simplified or kind of brought everything down to the point of doing that. And it seems to, I've heard a lot more success stories about that, and I don't know that I've ever heard a failure story about that one, but that could just be survivorship bias on the
Yeah, who's going to tell that story?
Right. Yeah. I tried it and I didn't survive. Fair enough.
Yeah, Castle. I think we want to hear about your candy cane.
Oh yeah. So he talks about the barber's pole, and so this you have the little spiral and everything. I mean, we've been seeing a lot of that there. The tree with the snake wrapped around it, or the bloody bandage around the arm, or what have you. But I was thinking about this with respect to what he says about a healthy individual as someone who achieves the perfect knowledge between the breath and the body, heaven and earth, and the perfect balance between the blood and the bones, time and space. So I was thinking about that with respect to, you have Christmas trees, and you have these sort of conical structures You know, I mean, I've heard of people using like marijuana plants as Christmas trees, but there's something so, you know, ridiculous about that that just doesn't fit, you know. And interestingly, those people actually got arrested right after they did that for something else. But so there's a sort of instability in breaking away from the traditional structure. But I was thinking about this sort of thing where, you know, and I know like the Pageau brothers sort of talk about the cosmic mountain and the sort of eschatological paradise as well, which kind of represents some of the older diagrams that we had of the pyramidal or conical structures with the different kind of layers. And it's widely regarded in tradition that, you know, even among the saints, like there's no equality doctrine or anything like that. Like there's at least like 9 different major degrees with also subdivisions and things like that of different types of saints. And it's not necessarily like a who's better or worse aspect either. It's a lot of the times more like who's more heavenly or earthly, and depending on your perspective, you know, like if you're an American that likes, you know, cowboy boots and monster trucks or something, you're probably not even going to be interested in the higher things like glass chandeliers and champagne and that sort of thing, you know, like that wouldn't be your speed anyway. But thinking about when you have as decorations different, you have lots of little candy canes that are normally put all around the different sort of decorations, just sort of relating that to the idea of like you have this little microcosm representation in the living room of the sort of eschatological paradise of all of these healthy individuals who have found perfect knowledge between time, space, and it's the other stuff, heaven and earth. And so just sort of that aspect. And, you know, you have not only that structure, but also their sort of straightness, but also their kind of leaning into the tree. Like I'm overreaching here just a little bit, but I just, the more I think about it, I haven't spent as much time about it, but I'm just thinking about kind of the tree as representation of eschatological paradise. I think it's a fun little meditative exercise.
Yeah, so the thing that stood out to me from what you were saying is that there's an appropriate higher and lower expression at any point in the hierarchy, right? So you can see the tree as the hierarchy, and so there's things at the bottom of the tree, and there's things that should be at the bottom of the bottom, and there's things that should be at the top of the bottom, right? Which so they're localized or fractal expressions of the bottom and the top of the tree itself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can connect that to decorations as well, right? Or maybe manifestations of glory, right? So like maybe if you're a worker, you do it with a glass of beer in the evening or whatever. While if you're high class, you want to have champagne, right? So there's this goes into the refinement as well, right? So like there's a refinement that is appropriate at the higher levels that is inappropriate at the lower levels because like it can't be integrated, right? So like, and we were talking about how the queen is dressed, and then it's inappropriate to dress more beautiful than the queen. It's like this, and these same patterns again.
And thinking about also like with the same respect of the candy canes also don't belong lying on the ground underneath the tree, and it would be wildly inappropriate to put a candy cane at the very top either. And actually, the higher up you get, the less really relevant the candy canes get, and the more difficult it gets actually because of their, you know, size. Like logistically, it's just a lot less realistic to put them right at the peak. But
and the children can't reach there, right? That's
exactly
also important.
Yeah. So there's a sort of relatability or like accessibility that's necessary there. Yeah, you should like some of the you say like the point of the tree is expressed by the rest of the tree, but at the same time, like the absolute lowest is not necessarily meant to, like, you wouldn't want to like just smash the point of the tree all the way down to the bottom or have like an upside down tree or something like that. And yet like participating in the structure allows you to be in communion with it anyway.
Yeah. And that participation with the structure, that's how you get the what he calls the perfect knowledge that you're working for. That's the mediation. You know, you are in the structure at a certain point, and that's where you mediate. And by mediating correctly, you're participating, and that's how you get that's where the perfect knowledge comes from.
Mm-hmm. Like a sort of submission to the structure.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder,
sitting in a box or something.
so I wonder then, having said that about the ornaments in the Christmas tree, if we take the microcosm of the blood in relationship to the human body, it's easy to see how blood can renew, or how blood can be the life of the flesh, because blood will be the circulatory system that's allowing the different part of the flesh to receive what they should receive and give them life and dynamism. But then how do you guys see this ornamental role of blood in relationship to the human body?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's ornamental, right? But if you make the connection with time that's on the page, right? You could say it's like it's initiating the transformation, right? So you could say that there's a calling from the external for the body to be a certain way, right? And like the blood is the impulse, right? It's pumping the response.
I would also offer hair as ornamental time.
Yeah.
I don't know. Women seem to love veins on an arm. You know, that's ornamental.
Yeah, vascularity.
That's a good point.
Not on their own.
No.
Right. So it's not, we'll say, universally ornamental, but hair generally is. Although I have my issues with that.
Also not universal, but for different reasons. So I wanted to point at this idea, right? So the knowledge, perfect knowledge between breath and the body, and so knowledge is described as a consequence of wisdom, right? Which is by which a house is built, right? Understanding by which a house is established, and then the knowledge is by which the chambers are filled with riches, right? And so the knowledge is the filling in, right? It's like, okay, so we have a room now, right? And something needs to occupy that room, right? And so the so in some sense, what is occupying the room is like a testament or a testimony to the house, right? Like to the functionality and the purpose of the house, that it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, and it it gives back in some sense, right? So it's like now it participates in the house again, in a I guess in a manner of subsidiarity, right? Like it derives its existence from the establishment of the house, and so perfect knowledge is the goodness or the glory in that, in some sense.
I just want to add to that. I think also just this aspect of knowledge, or like final integration or something like that for this healthy person, that that because there's all these different possible levels, and then also like sub levels and everything, to the point where there's no point really counting them. There's probably so many that you could just have an actual spot just for one specific candy cane or person or whatever. But that there's a sort of there's this notion of that everyone in the eschatological paradise has the fullness of every virtue insofar as they had the capacity for it, or something like that. So like maybe their capacity for, modesty or something like that was actually unbelievably low, but it's still full to like that really tiny capacity that they had. And you could think of kind of like, I mean, just a sort of mundane example, those sort of things where you have like the different color sliders and like brightness and contrast and those sort of things, that you could have all of these different combinations that you can come out with a very unique color or gradient or what have you by having all of these different things placed a certain way, even if they're much more dim. And it's, especially if you're going for a very large image trying to integrate all the different colors, it's necessary to have that contrast between all of those. And then to just kind of reiterate the thing of, that a lot of people wouldn't be satisfied if they were all just completely cranked up all the way, like every single slider maxed out on the thing. Like, I have no use for silk, like absolutely zero use for silk. Like, just, I don't want to, I have no aspirations to have tea with the queen, or any of those things. And I would be much happier with like a new leather jacket or something like that.
Yeah, I like this fullness of virtue thing, because to relate that back to my intention, frustration, right? So I think a way in which things get frustrated is people are not aspiring to feel their virtue. so they're losing hope, right? They're no longer trying to attain what is attainable, and that means that the game changes, right? Like I've been framing the issues or the distinctions between the political camps as how do you approach things, right? Do you approach them from fear or from goodness, right? Hermeneutics of suspicion or hermeneutics of harmony, or like do you approach them in as awesome or awful? And these the approach gives them a certain stature to you, right? Like it displays them to you in a certain manner. It highlights certain things. Like it the way that they appear is functionally distinct, even though you're relating to the same physical representation. And as a consequence, right, like a certain option space opens up, right? So like if you see a lion and you think it's scary, right? Like you got an option space of fight and run or play dead, basically, right? And like that's really boring in some sense, right? If you see a lion in front of you and you're like seeing the majesty within his manes and whatever, right? Then what you can do with that lion is endless. It's infinite, right? Now, maybe you shouldn't, right? Like maybe the fear is the proper response, but those two sides can't be reconciled, right? Like if you're in fear, you can't see the majesty. Like it's just not an option, right? And if you see the majesty, like I don't know if you can get to the fear, like because it's nonsensical. Like it doesn't make sense from the perspective that you're watching. And yeah, so this virtue aspect, right? Like if you feel depleted in your virtue, right? If you feel empty in that, right? Like things become to be feared, right? Because there's an appeal that you can't respond to, right? And now you're insufficient. And that's when the frustration comes in. So I guess I want to continue a little bit on that. At the bottom of the page, it says, in this context, the powers that healed the individual could also be used to heal the community and the cosmos itself, right? So I have, well, it's interesting that he used the word power. So there's an affordance, right? And I think Castle maybe the word virtue would be better, right? Like because in some sense of virtue, I don't know if this is correct, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's like an allowance, like it affords things to happen. And if you don't have that allowance, certain things can't happen.
Well, I would just add to that the veer in virtue is related actually just to the word man, and so but man as mediator is sort of like a mediating allowance of like kind of being able to get a lot of things done that couldn't otherwise get done without that mediation. So like virtue is like manliness or something like that.
Well, it's more related to man's interaction with the higher thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so in terms of affordance, it's something like a positive only affordance or something. Right. It's along those lines. It's not along the lines of there's lots of affordances and most of them are bad. Right. So yeah, that's why discernment is the only thing that matters. Ultimately, like you have to have discernment. If you don't, and lots of it, right? And you have to apply it in the right place, because if you're discerning the political landscape by thinking about left and right, or even just left, right, and center or something, it's never going to work, right? If you're using a economic frame to discern human behavior, it's never going to work. Right? It's not that it's not going to seem to work, or it's not going to work for a while, or you're not going to be able to find after the fact correlations or something. You can do all that, but it's not virtuous. It's never going to work. And that it's that nature of affordance. It's something like a pure affordance, right? Or an affordance with no downside or something. An affordance that allows for reciprocally opening or something, if you want to get fancy vervaeke words about the whole thing. So I think that's the best way to think about it. And I think when you do that, yeah, I don't like the use of the word powers at all here. Even though I think, I don't think I can. Yeah, I don't think I can match it up with my sort of hard and fast definition that I have on navigating patterns here. But so that's why I don't like it, because it's not well defined, and I don't think it's wrong. It's like, man, I'd like a little clarity around that, because
the way I see it is you could imagine it as streams, right? Of energy streams or water flows that you can tap into, and that can lift you or move you, and so it's like an external something that you can use. Like, I think that's the but I think the distinction between virtues and powers is that the virtues are related to man and powers are related to nature. So
yeah, that's a possible way to think about it for sure. Yeah, I just, like I said, I don't like the fuzzy or non-existent definition of powers. I mean, it's a great placeholder for a bunch of things, but also a bunch of things.
and well, so the other words that were used in that sentence is healing and individual. We're just going to ignore individual because we should use person there. But healing is making whole, right? So like that's it's like there's a reunification that needs to happen because there's disorder, right? But the disorder is not the loss of identity or something, right? Like, so it's not the loss of the unity. The unity is just disease, right? And so the healing is, like, to go back to what Elias said, it's the blood moving things back into coherence, right? Because the coherence is disrupted.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I mean, just you get the classic example of the whole like clean your room, like do the thing in your own microcosm, and then that will have white spilling consequences. And just thinking of that with respect to also the sort of like people say, oh, this this room is a mess. I'm going to turn it upside down. And like that's a comment sort of saying that I heard growing up, where it's just like, oh, this entire place, it's a mess. We're going to turn it upside down, and we're going to get this thing, back in order. And so there is that aspect of, okay, you're revivifying it. There is the sort of time aspect of, all right, we're going to kind of get this back into order by doing the double negative thing. And because if it were in its right place, then just grabbing all the items and putting them somewhere else would just be ridiculous. But that already happened. And so there is that aspect. And then just kind of, I guess at that point, I don't know if it would be something like the exemplification of that is then kind of like the stretching out of the spirit or something, and then other people can kind of imitate that.
Yeah, so what I imagine your example to be is like there's a flooding, right? So there's an overpopulation of whatever in the room, right? And then the order that pre-existed the overpopulation is no longer capable of reordering, and so you have to appeal to something new to establish order again.
It's sort of a renewal, but also kind of like a like whatever the proper order was, that's just not being like manifested or something like that. Like it has to be again remanifested, but that requires like, I mean, that's the thing too. Like if the room is a mess, like sometimes you have to completely just remove everything out of the room entirely and then start all the way over, like something like that. But that there is like a proper order, and maybe you could kind of align to a better one. Like maybe it's like, oh, I never used the shelving system this way as last time, or something like that. And you can kind of reorganize or even move some of the items around or something to further renew that room. But yeah, so it's sort of a changing, but it's also kind of like the to your point about the flood, like the thing of, oh, you have the global flood, like it's a new Earth, but also it's the same Earth, but also new.
Well, I think rebalance is the key here. I mean, right, a lot of healing has nothing to do with you don't heal someone by putting them back together by constituent parts. You're not healing anything at that point. And things like revivification are more like realignment and rebalance than they are about building something up or any of that, right? And so bloodletting, which to your point, Castle, is still used. They still use leeches. Sorry, in hospitals in the West. Those things are more about rebalance, and to the earlier point of fasting, right? That's rebalance, right? You're resetting, you're providing contrast, and then your body goes, "Oh, this is what it's like to starve to death." Maybe I should process my food more carefully, right? Because it loses that, you like with anything, you lose that sense at some point. And so, yeah, having it revivified or recontrasted or put back together for you, reordered, is important, and that rebalancing is key to perfecting the unity, right? Not creating it. That's a different part of the process, but you want to keep it in balance, and you want to keep it you want to keep it revivified and reordered and stable.
Yeah, and I think
this makes me a little bit, I guess, curious or something. So the idea of bloodletting in the West, I guess it's like really ancient, but it developed into the idea of the four humors. So you have these 4 different liquids, and so you actually need all of them to kind of be in balance. And there was this model of how if you're too angry, then you have too much of this, and if you're too melancholic, then you have too much of that. I think that's what the whole idea, like someone being sanguine, where that comes from, and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I just wonder what are the kind of not bloodletting, but bile letting practices perhaps used to be.
There's an interesting aspect of that. So something that I actually do daily is I drink a little bit of I drink a cup of water that has a little bit of apple cider vinegar in it, and I drink that with a straw so that I don't get it on my teeth or anything like that. But if you have it cold, it's actually quite pleasant, and you actually don't feel the burn if you use a straw for some reason. But or even if you do, you can put cinnamon in there, and that helps. But I noticed that that's something that a lot of people, and I recommend it to people that, like, I didn't have the problem. I was doing it specifically as sort of like a fasting aid. But I recommend to friends that have things like acid reflux or heartburn or those sorts of things to take that, because a lot of times what's given to these people is antacids. And so these people are, oh, there's too much acid because I'm having acid reflux or I'm having heartburn or something like that. And so I must reduce the amount. But actually, you're getting the vapors of a low quantity of the acid. So if you actually increase the amount of acid, you actually don't get the vapors anymore, because it's like having a car that has low fluids, and then it winds up kind of like bubbling up and gurgling and doing these weird things, and eventually you get damage. But for some reason, like they recommend the reverse of giving more, to your point of like the different types of bile or what have you. And even for I forget what it is. It's like kidney stones or something like that, or like liver damage. They actually prescribe capsules of actual ox bile, which you never want to bite into. But if you take that, like that actually can break down the excess of space of these stones that can develop in your system. So yeah, so again, to your point, like it's the same thing as the bloodletting, where, oh yeah, we stopped doing the 4 humors, but also we're still doing the 4 humors.
So at the bottom of the page, it talks about modern medicine, right? And like, what is modern medicine? Well, it's adding parts, right? Like, oh, like or it's putting parts back at their place, right? Like, oh, like you have a cut and we're just gonna mend the cut, or you have a break, things, we're gonna like put them straight again. But the part where it's healing, right? Like that's just like magic. like that would just happen. Like the rebalancing, the finding of an equilibrium, and your stomach is damn, I forgot the word, but it's it got like a whole lot of acidity with different chemicals, right? And so it's a buffer. There we go. It's a buffered solution. So if something non-acidic comes into it, because of all the components, it doesn't go out of balance, right? Because there's so many things contributing that in order to upset the balance, like a lot of things would have to counteract, basically. And so like you could see, look at your body that way as well, right? Like it just like as a bunch of things going on, and you could say, well, like in some sense there's parallel functionality or whatever, so that even if there's a disruption on one layer, like the other layers can compensate in a manner, right? And like at a certain point that breaks, right? Like at a certain point that capacity gets exceeded, and now you have to reestablish order, right? And like if you look at, well, all these doing things with the fluids, right? Because the buffer is a fluid which has dissolved a bunch of things, right? So it contains and so if you start working with the fluids, what you're actually saying is we're going to create an atmosphere or something, like it's it's something that you live within, right? Like that facilitates. It's related to the feminine in that sense, right? It's like the ground that is able to sustain life.
And there's this aspect of, I mean, now just thinking about the stomach as well, you've got like the gut microbiome as well, and that's another sort of buffer that you have. And there are, just to kind of point out, like there are consequences to over revivification, and that so there is a sort of aspect of you get a lot of times people will be prescribed antibiotics, and then to counter that, you have to take probiotics, or prebiotics, or all these other things. And it's just like, okay, you're just going to do this, but now it's like having a company with just massive turnover, where it's just like, okay, like, yeah, the number of microbes is, assuming you could actually measure that, it's like, oh, the number of employees in the space is more or less the same. It's like, great, but also, like, you're changing them out so often that you can't actually have the stability of, oh, they actually know what they're supposed to be buffering for.
So getting back to the book, we have multiple scales, right? And we have the same structure manifesting in those scales, and those structures are related, right? They're related because they're images. They're related because they have similar functionality. Like, I don't know if that's the same thing. Like, it's somewhat the same thing, but so one of the problems that I have, and we'll get into that more, but is like, I think the right way to think about it is that you have the godly pattern, right? The heavenly, the universal pattern, right? And the images are constrained applications of that pattern. So in order to relate to the pattern, you need to see it in the godly version, right? So that you can see it at every application layer, you can recognize it, right? But like Mark was saying, like, we are living at the human level, right? So our understanding or the relatability for us is most there on the human scale.
I think we saw a bit of that in, I don't know if it was the previous chapter or the one before, where Matthieu kind of talks about, like, getting to know God through the microcosm of the garden, and that aspect of, like, well, you can understand through creation as a whole, but also then within the microcosm of that you have, it's a lot more seed-like. Like, you don't have all the different manifestations to kind of contrast or anything like that, but at least you have a very condensed version of that. But it's very difficult to relate at the higher scales.
Yep, the scales as contrast. That's one way to do it, right? The things you're looking up at, the things you're looking down at, right? And also, I mean, yeah, there's only 3 diagrams here, but actually, the practicality continues downward to lower scales, right? And that's so if you engage with somebody like Michael Levin, they're just discovering that. They're like, oh, this works exactly like this thing at the higher scale. Now, they don't use any of those terms, probably because they're a little on the slow side. But like, they're just, like, science is sort of catching up to this. It's like, well, it's been there all along, but thanks. And that's, that's important to note, because these scales that are above us, we have very severe limitations that we cannot get around. And they're different for different people, which is where it makes it worse from our perspective, to understand them. So we can't understand them in their fullness, in their totality. And if you tried, you'd blow up, you'd die. Like, it's another symbol that's all over all the wisdom texts, by the way, all of them. It doesn't matter what culture you're looking at. So that's important to understand. But the thing here is, of course, the mediation, and I would argue that the cones are the expression of the mediation and the limits of that mediation. So there's 2 types of mediation going on. There's the mediation between the 3 things and the center, we'll say, right? And there's arrows there to give you sort of a sense for what's going on, what the flow is, if you will. But there's also the mediation between the layers. Right, because obviously the inner atom is pointing at the atom, right, and then that scale of the garden is in the center of God, time, and space, and so there's, at least 3 separate signals here that you can grasp onto to sort of start to understand the idea of mediation, right? It's not the whole thing. The mediation is only dealing with a part of the thing greater than itself, but the mediation also happens as the thing that manifests the unity, right? And that goes back to what we were just talking about, which is keeping things in balance, right? Or keeping them properly ordered or something, right? Keeping the flood away, but also keeping enough on hand, right? Because you also don't want the opposite of a flood, which is a drought. And all of that is contained within this particular diagram, if you can sort of get there in your head. And again, if you can't, it's fine. Right? Reread the book slower, right? You'll really contemplate the chapters. Don't fly through it, and hopefully that'll come out for you.
I want to add one more thing to what you said, because I really like the points you made, and I made a bunch of connections. And one of the things I want to add is also, if you look at this is also, if you just sort of project that, even though the cones are like a point that's, or maybe like a flashlight or something like that, being shone down through these different levels, that you could also look at this as sort of a sideways cone. So there's a sort of point being expressed from the large cosmic macrocosm, and then all the way down into these smaller little layers. And so sort of the image comes to mind as well, if you have this, even though it's a flatter image, but thinking of like a whole bunch of different cogs and gears and stuff, and that you could have like one, if they're properly interconnected, all the little teeth, that you could turn one of the tiny ones, and you could have large impacts on all of the other ones just by having like a spindle on one particular one. And I'm thinking about, and I don't have like an answer to this or anything, but some of the things that I was thinking about was this aspect of the larger pattern being expressed as a point in one precise place, having large implications. So I was thinking about, I don't remember if it was Elijah or Elisha. It was Elisha, actually. It was right before he died. He gives an order to a guy and says, okay, you're going up against, I don't know if it was like the Philistines or whoever it was that they were fighting at the time. And he said, what I want you to do is I want you to strike the ground with an arrow multiple times. And then like that'll determine like how well the country does at war. And it's just like, and he goes and he does it. And he only strikes the ground like 3 times. And he's like, you idiot, like you should have done it 5 or 6 times, like the number for work or something. And you would have wiped them all out. Now you guys, you're going to like win. And then like there'll be a problem later. And then he dies. And it's just like, what's going on there? But there's a little bit of that, like, okay, here's a microcosm of the point being expressed. And then something, to the point of like, well, you can't fully integrate the entire giant pattern at your layer. And yet there's something going on. And then it also reminds me of the that bit in the book of Hosea, which is pretty short for the folks at home. But there's some of like the coldest lines in the Bible, which get turned around in a really wonderful way. But I remember just being frozen solid, like reading the stuff that God says, and then he goes and he says, okay, Hosea, like we've got a project. I'm going to have you go and marry a prostitute because my people are whoring after other gods. And it's like, you're going to be a microcosm. You're going to go do this. Now you're going to have a son, and you're going to call him not my people because these people aren't my people anymore. And then you're going to have a daughter, and you're going to call her No Mercy because I'm about to have no mercy on these people. Like, that's amazing. And then he turns it around, and as this person, as Hosea's family is being grown, and the wife is no longer a prostitute, and like the family as microcosm is actually turning into like a nice functioning family, then he goes and he says, I'll have mercy on no mercy, and no people will be my people. And it's like the kid, but then also talking about like the fact that was played out on the family scale. They clean their room, and then that's going to be kind of like a pivot point for the revivification of the nation. It's like how that works technically, just do the thing. Like just clean your room.
Well, I like this idea, right? You call it a pivot point, and like I had in my mind, it's like the buck stops here, right? Mm-hmm. And you bounce back. Like the fractal, it's no longer going to replicate. Like we're going to roll it back up the other way.
Yeah.
I wanted to add a bunch of things. So you see the pattern, right, with the cones. Like this is actually the same thing that Plato does in the Republic. Like it has the big scale, right, the ideal, and then it's like, well, like, can we do it at human scale, right? And then what he does is he starts inserting the layer of the city, right? And like that's what happens in Genesis as well, right? So we start off with the simple one-on-one relationship, right? And then complexity slowly it gets added in. And I'm sure that Matthieu Pageau is also following that pattern in this book too. So that's basically the build-up, right? So you like you could say, well, like we're gonna have the individual unit or something of the fractal, right? Like the unit where the buck stops. But like I don't know if that exists. But also there is something that gets lost when you go too deep down, right? Like the interfacing parts or the holes that can be made from the interfacing parts lose certain qualities, right? So you could see how the human has, like, I don't know, like the optimal set of qualities that can reflect God, right? And like if you go to animals or something, right, like lower forms or plants even, that they don't have it, but there's nothing really above humans but collections of humans, right? And you get this weird relationships there. And then we also have the issue of mediating, right? So it's like you have these layers, and then they relate to each other, right? And so that's where the movement that Christopher was talking about comes in.
Yeah, I'm thinking also this thing of, like, the buck stopping, or the motion being moved as a means of kind of getting it back on track. I was thinking a little bit of, like, like runaway trains, that sort of thing. That that is a thing that's happened, and like there are people that have, like, died in the crash of trying to stop that and that sort of thing. But you have that there's those little, like, levers, where you switch the tracks, and they're like automated now, but that sort of thing of, like, oh, if you have two tracks that are more or less like side by side, but one for sure is not actually connected to anything, then it's like, okay, we need to go up here and make a tiny change so that so everything else can keep flowing.
Yeah, that's a cutting of that which you can't control in some sense.
I like the point about the small manifestation, or the small enactment of something being like the seed. I think our participation in that is exemplification, because we're taking something and then we're allowing that to spread, because you're following the example of someone, but then also you're being an example of someone else. So you're sort of you get to be a link or a branch or something. That's nice.
Do you feel complete on this chapter?
Yeah, I was just going to point out with everything that was just said, that goes to the note at the very bottom of the page there. He talks about the placebo effect. And I don't know, he says that this is like self-referential down there. And I think that's not what's happening. It's things are not referencing themselves. They're referencing their place in the fractal microcosm relation.
Right. Well, and actually, I would blame that idea of self-referential influence of renewal phrasing on the fact that they're not differentiating fracticality from self-similar fracticality, which is technically different. That's why I like to say self-similar fractal, right? Because then you get the idea that the thing that is self-similar about the fractal is the principle, roughly speaking, if you wanted to map it sort of one-to-one to math, that's what would happen. Is you'd say, so one of the ways you create a fractal is you pick a seed number and you have a formula, and the formula never changes, right? But as you feed the number into the formula and you feed the result back in, that's the self-reference, right? The number changes, the formula never changes, right? So the formula is like the principle. And then if you pick a different starting number, you get a completely different, like they're vastly different in most of these formulas, vastly different output. And there's all sorts of other things you can do, but it's also, people don't understand fractal math, Mandelbrot sets and such, not simplest thing in the world. It's one algorithm and one number, and then all you're doing is taking the output and feeding it back into the input. That's it. That's the whole thing. And those algorithms don't have to be super sophisticated either. They're very simple mathematical formulas. It's not like the Google recommender algorithm, right? It's literally just a bunch of math statements, and some of them can be horrifically simple, and you're like, whoa, this is insane how easy this is. And that's why you can run a Mandelbrot set on an 8-bit computer from the 80s, which you can look that up online. It's very funny to watch, and it's not even necessarily that slow, because the thing that determines the speed is generally the resolution and not the formula itself, because they're very simple.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind, right? So we have here in the center of the image, you have all these things coming together, right? And so like the fractal thing is only one of the things that is coming together, right? So there's other parts in that space, right? So there's a space or a body, right? So Adam gets the breath injected to him, right? So there's a space for life created, and participating in that life is that fractal pattern, but also other fractal patterns, and so the way that fractal pattern manifests is in relation to all the other patterns that are happening there too.
I guess if I could just make a quick point in relation to that and what we were talking about before with the virtue thing, that it's necessary to have the multiple points of contrast as well. And like, it reminds me of, there was some sometimes for contrast, some of like spiritual writers would give an example of a person that was extremely full in one virtue, but then like lacking in all of the other ones, but just to exemplify that one thing as clearly as they possibly could. And I thought about the one where it's like, I think Alphonsus Liguori writes about some monk from many hundreds of years ago that was extremely modest. He was so careful about, he never wanted to see anybody, especially like he didn't want to be scandalized by ever even like having the concept of what a woman looked like in his mind. Like he wanted no distractions whatsoever. He wanted to live in the desert. That was it. And a high status woman like a princess or queen or somebody went out to talk to this holy man and ask for his blessing or for him to pray for her or something like that. And so she asks, and he says, he flat out says no, and says, I'm going to pray that I forget that you ever came here. And it's just like, he's lacking in any kind of charity whatsoever, but he's so over connected to like modesty and having custody over his eyes, which is like important, but also that's like his one thing, like he's not rounded out with a few other, points of contrast.
Okay. Yeah, so was it Matthieu who talked about simplicity? I think so, right? So I think simplicity is maybe best understood as the lack of inter-entanglement of multiple patterns, right? So the more you go down, the more complexity increases. That's the interaction of more things at once. And so when we make things simple, we remove the interaction, right? And then clarity arises. Okay. Going to the trees in the garden as mediators. So here's where my objections are starting to pile up. So here we get the issue of good and bad versus good and evil. So I'm still wondering like why you want to use bad, right? Like so, evil is in participation, right? Like it implies a human actor, and bad is more like a descriptive labeling, right? You could basically say, well, like it either is or isn't, and right. So if it is, then it's good, and if it is not, then it's bad. And so I think also evil is there for like in process, right? Like it's evolving, like it's manifesting, while bad is just a statement or description that's flat.
I would add.
And
Oh, please go ahead.
well, so in it, I'm relating this to Jesus saying, "I did not come here to judge," right? And it's like, okay, like when can we judge? Well, we can only judge when things are fulfilled, right? We can only establish the ultimate contribution of something when the story is ended. And so when we're saying evil, right, we're in some sense talking about giving a swing to the direction of the story, right? Like it's moving away or moving towards the tellers effectively, right? And when we're talking about bad, like I don't know, like it's like setting it in stone or something. I don't know, like and in some sense it's also saying it's irredeemable, right? Like it's like the ultimate consequence of it is already predetermined or something.
I would disagree. Just I'm thinking about soup here. Like I can't help it. I'm a little hungry here, but
Okay.
I'm thinking about soup. So you imagine a soup that it has all the ingredients but no salt. Like that's some bad soup. And but you add some salt, and now it's potentially good soup. Like if all the other elements are there and you just forgot to put salt, like it's more or less redeemable by just adding the one ingredient, or like it wasn't ready yet, or like you have like eating raw meat is bad, but refining it is good, or depending on how it's prepared. I mean, also you think like certain types of raw fish or whatever, but maybe like maybe it's bad for the one thing. So like if I have a piece of raw meat, like maybe I could use it to befriend a dog, like that might be good. Maybe it's bad for me to have that at all.
So like what I just noticed is you see the dynamic, right? Because like when you say it's bad, like you close things down, and then it's like, well, no, but what about the exception? Like what about the exception? And I think evil is contextualized, right? So it's like, well, in this situation, taking these 5 things into account or something, right? And so like maybe you would say like a baby did the same action in the same situation, you wouldn't call it evil, right? Like so there's also the agent and the participation of and the capacity of the agent involved.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, right? Because on the one hand, I don't like it because the way I slice bad versus evil is material versus ethereal. And that's actually winds up to be really important to make that distinction in the wording. But it's not applicable here. So I don't have that particular objection because he's not in that, not using any of that framing at all. But what's occurred to me is that I think the reason why he's differentiating the two and subclassing evil into a type of bad, say a spiritual type of badness or something, it is based on the fruit, right? So you wouldn't know, we'll say, positive work from negative work or good work from bad work without the knowledge of bad. And that doesn't to your point, Manuel, it doesn't make it evil, right? Because that's a different thing. And I think that sort of puts it in a different light for me as to why he's, and again, it was always a minor difference on my side. I was always like, well, I don't know why you would do that, because that seems unnecessary. But, having the distinction, like I said, between a material idea and an ethereal idea, and keeping bad on the material side and evil in the ethereal realm, which is really helpful for the stuff I normally talk about. So in some sense, I don't have a dog in that fight at all. But now I can see some of the utility given, eating of the fruit in particular. It's like, well, you were in the garden, you're doing whatever you were doing, but there, in some sense, there's no work in the garden. And so the work is the result of the fruit, right? Or at least the ability to discern work from garden is in the whatever you're gaining from the fruit. And so now all of a sudden you need a new set of classifications that you didn't need. But like, one way to look at this whole garden thing is, and the fall, is to say, before the fall, you didn't need these classifications. They weren't interesting or important. There's a whole set level of discernment that's just irrelevant, because it's stuff that can't happen, right? And so, right, like you don't need silly words like transistor, right, until you're trying to do stuff with transistors, and now all of a sudden you need a bunch of jargon that you didn't need before, some of which is just jargon. It's co-opted words from that we already had, right, that are specific to the context, and some of it is new words, right, that have to be created to represent new things that didn't exist in the world. And so that's sort of how I'm seeing it now. I didn't see it that way 10 minutes ago. so I actually kind of appreciate, I have a better appreciation for why he's going down that road, I think.
I'm thinking a little bit of the because I like the aspect of the sort of judgment thing, and that contrast with the ethereal versus the sort of earthly or material being either bad or evil. But I'm thinking of that thing of like, being able to judge intent on somebody, where it's just like, that is ultimately, and like Mark has said this a few times, like that pragmatically, like, you can't actually judge the person's intent. Like, I can project on you, and I can do that and say like, oh, this is why this guy did this. But I mean, like, maybe he had something else in mind. Maybe he's got like a brain tumor or some sort of brain damage or something like that. I have no idea why maybe he's got some secret mission from the government that I am, not, it's too classified for me to understand, something like that. It's like, I couldn't possibly know. Now, pragmatically, I can see the actions and I can respond to that. I can do the discernment, judgment, action thing. And, but ultimately, like, placing myself as, in a usurping position over like this person's soul, like, oh, this person did a bad thing, and therefore I have to respond in a certain way, versus this person is a bad person, and therefore, to the gulags they go, or something like that. And I was thinking also with respect to guard, it's just like a sort of present day example, which is ridiculous and absolutely horrific, is thinking about you get like that aspect of, oh, there's not really that much work in the garden. And it's true, like there's not much mediation actually required. But you think of like those suburban guys that are really proud of their lawns, that they get like really competitive about it too. And then you got, some snake from the homeowners association sending you letters about how your grass is like a quarter inch too high or something like that. And now you have this unnecessary standard of work that you need to maintain and keep up with, which sometimes can contribute to the sort of like, what do you say, like opponent processing between neighbors over their lawns, which is just like so ridiculous and unnecessary. But people get caught up in this,
Yeah, like I don't want to go too deep into good and bad, because I think it will come up again. But I think it's also like, what is the first thing that happens? Well, like, first thing that happens is that they go against the will of God, right? In taking the fruit, right? So, in other words, it's pre-established and known to them which actions are good and evil, right? Because but they're inherited by the authority of God. And then when they eat of the tree, you end up in a different dynamic. So it's and they will be like gods as well. So if we go to the text, it's I saw a bunch of things because I looked it up in the King James version, right? So at first it says God said to Adam, from all the all the trees, missing the s, of the garden you must eat, but like that's not what the King James says. It says you may eat. So I'm not sure why there's an imperative here, and it seems like he's constructing or just constructing a narrative that's contributing to his telos there. Then at the second line he says it said to the woman, right? And so the it is referring to the snake. In the King James it says he said to the woman. So like the snake is assigned masculine nature, right? And so the thing that I have, right, like from there your eyes will be open, you will be like God, knowing good from bad, right? It's like, well, like they got told, right? And you could say, well, like that's not real knowledge, right? But anyway, like there's something with the participating and the opening of the space as a consequence of experiencing something, right? And then the rules of the game change, right? And we can go back to the idea of final participation, right? So the final participation would then be the reestablishment of the relationship with the knowledge of your responsibility of the knowledge or something. Which is the bug again, right? Like it's the correct manifestation of the pattern at a lower layer so that you can reconnect to the higher layer or something, and that you're in harmony. And then the final line, it says, so God exiled the human from the Garden of Eden to work the ground, which is to till the ground in King James, which is a specific type of work, from which it came, right? And again, he's using it, which is referencing to Adam, right? To the human, which is he also made human, and like so in the King James it says he. So I don't know why he's desexualizing this, like why he's making.
I think I might know what he's doing. So because he does most of his Bible reading in Hebrew, I think this is Matthieu's own translation of the passage.
Yeah, well, it's
100% his own translation, and to be honest, I trust it more because of that for some reason.
I think also from all the tree of the garden, I think is actually a clever thing he's doing to lead up to a point he's going to make later in this chapter. I think he deliberately made that awkward.
So yeah, the last line as well, right? Like the working of the ground is relating to the emergence, right? So there's the trees are planted by God, right? Now Adam is responsible for the planting, right? And in some sense he can't plant trees because he needs to plant fields, right? So he can't make the thing that goes above him, right? Like he can only there's talking about the layers of the Christmas tree, right? Like he's planting crops that feed him. So I think that's that is a consequence. So if you're under a principle, right, then the principle informs your actions, right? And if you then take the place of the principle, right, like now everything references you, right? And so in some sense you need to be responsible and connect that back up all the way to the principle again, because else you become self-referential.
And that's with the judgment thing as well. Of, oh, you'll be like God, and it's just like, okay, like really, you want to be responsible for everything and have to judge absolutely everything? Like, oh, all of a sudden everything is your problem. Well done, you know.
Oh yeah, before I forget, I wanted to make a point in the last chapter, right? So there's this idea of polymaths, right?
Yeah.
So polymaths, they have multiple domains, right, or multiple principles or multiple ontologies that they are familiar with, and they unify things, right? So the thing that happened in science is that like it's no longer possible to familiarize yourself with sufficient things to be a proper polymath, like because there's too many domains, right? And now you get domains of cross domains, right? So cognitive science is one of these things, right, where they're trying to unify multiple domains, and have them join as one, right? So what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to relate to the practicality, right? Like, so, okay, like why, like how is this pattern manifesting in this domain and in that domain, and like how can we connect them to say that they're the same, and that, I don't know, like basically unifying things again, right? And like that unification happened in theology, right?
But
And
that's their reversal too.
Yeah,
right?
it's like a
Project of
reverse
science.
engineering.
But the project of science is to dissect, and now they're trying to reverse that process, right, in a scientific way from the bottom up, which is why a lot of these disciplines are complete garbage, right? They're just recapitulations of things better said in other places, that just aren't, quote, scientific or whatever, and so that it's reversing itself in some sense, but it's doing it from the bottom up inappropriately when, like I said, there's already better solutions available to whatever it is they think that they're trying to resolve. And
And
yeah, it is that reversal that I want to stress here.
yes, and I want to say, like, that was the intended role of philosophy in science, to be the unifier. And what's interesting is that philosophy stranded in relativism. So it's incapable of fulfilling the role and bearing that authority, and then it gets reinvented, right? So it's interesting that, like, you the need for the higher thing, right, the unifying thing, gets reinvented or rediscovered even in all the lower fields, right? So that's also a fractal pattern that we see.
It's like trying to recreate a tree by just taking a bunch of like fallen branches and then gluing them back together in the image that you
Right.
think it's supposed to be. Like they've literally done that with like like dinosaur dig sites and stuff, but they'll find like actual dinosaur bones, but then those will be right next to like raccoon bones, and they'll assume that was part of the skeleton, and then they'll make some horrific chimera, and they're like, "Oops, actually, we did some testing on this, and those are from a raccoon."
Yeah, and so to connect that back to what we're talking about in this chapter, right? So if your polymath is not connecting all the way back up, right, to the garden or to the heaven, then you end up with the polymath being the top as a god, right? And so you end up in the same problem as the fall, right? And that needs to be reconciled there.
Yeah, and I think to that point, right, what is the taking of the fruit? We'll say early is a separation of the fruit from the tree before the receiver is ready. The fruit may or may not be right. That's not important in the story, right? But the person eating the fruit was not ready to receive the fruit.
Yeah, like I think I made a note a little bit later on. It's like, are we even capable of ever being ready? Because, like, maybe we're not. Like, it's just always a leap of faith.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't matter. But there's no way for us to know. And who cares? We should have done what we were told.
Yeah.
So next, unless someone wants to go over more. So in the top graph, right? Like he's making a binary, and he's connecting that to good and bad. And like I don't like that move. Like I don't like the move. You could say, right? Like okay, like there's a true pattern, right? And so not having the true pattern is bad. But then you'd have to be able to observe that and recognize that, right? Because else there's a distinction there that you can't really make, or discernment that you can't really make.
Well, I mean, I don't think he's using it that way. He's using it, both patterns are balanced, right? And probably in the world we'll say, but one is bad because it leads to death and exile, and the other one is good because it leads to life in the homeland, right? And you can see the time and space relation in there too, right? That he's already established, and he's relating it to the mountains, and the question mark in the middle is part of the discernment. So I think those are important components, because he's not. This isn't saying one is good and one is bad, right? It's saying it's contingent upon the center.
I would add that in the case of the two mountains, that like people, like when they actually had the mountain of the curse and the mountain of the blessing, that people were living in between that. So there is the sort of aspect of people kind of going about their everyday business in between these two mountains. So there is like discernment sort of happening between them, and that the way that the laws are printed on the mountain of the curse are kind of like photo negatives of the blessing. So it's kind of like, you will not do this bad thing. Whereas with the blessing one, it's like, you're going to do this good thing, and that's going to be good. And like these are the good things that are going to happen as related to that.
So the way that I envisioned this is that you can have like a principle, like, and I see it as like a point, and then you orbit around it, right? Because like you're never at the principle, because you could put it as a sling, right? And like the sling is connected to the center, and it's just making circles, right? And like the circles are just mutations that occur, right? And then you can have a mutation that is severing the connection, severing the string, right? And I think that's what's being pointed at the exile and the death. But again, right? Like now we got go into an identity problem, right? Because it's like it's a non-identity, right? And it's a consequence of the existence of the string, that the string can be severed. So yeah, I don't, yeah, I don't, I'm not happy with the framing that he's using here. And if we go to Deuteronomy 15 to 19, at a certain point it's described as the turning away of the heart, and that's equated to worshiping other gods, right? So it's again articulated in the movement away from, right? Which is presuming that you're adhering to, right? So there's an existing order that's presupposed in order for that to happen.
I think it comes back to the sort of intention thing as well. Like I was thinking about, I'm putting together this little some notes on something, and one of the things that came up as I was kind of researching for is the idea that piety and purity are actually linked etymologically, and so there is this sort of connection to just kind of like being like of single mind of doing something that if you're impious, then say like with respect to like giving proper respect to a grandfather or something like that, that if you're being impious, that you're even if you're kind of like partially being pious to them, there's some other little thing that's going elsewhere. And I sort of connected that as I was kind of looking at those words to sincerity. So when you say like, oh, sincerely yours, you're saying like singularly, like completely yours. When you say that thing, not like, oh, well, if I write a letter to somebody and maybe like I'm doing something for this person or something like that, and I say it's sincerely yours, but really I'm like 20% of me kind of wants them to pay me back, or like I'm gonna use this as leverage on them later on. Like it's not really sincere. So I just wanted to kind of make that association.
Yeah, so at the bottom half in the center, it says, instead, death and exile are viewed as the natural consequences of the losing the tree of life, right? And the way that they lose the tree of life, right, is by being exiled, by being banned, right? So the loss is it's a consequence, right? It's not not an action. Let's just say it that way. And again, right? Like so when he's talking about the tree of death as the absence of the tree of life, right? Like this is pointing at the problem that I'm talking about, right? So like the tree of death doesn't have an identity, right? Like it's a non-identity.
Right, but that's why he, notice the icon he uses. It's the same as for the flood. So, and he couches the tree of death as an identification against. Right. So there is no tree of death that you can point to because it's just not the tree of life. And that's actually an appropriate use of that identification against. Right. In other words, it's not an identification, a positive identification, and therefore all things that are not this, end with this result, we'll say. And that's actually really, it's important to know when and how to use identification against. And I would say this is the perfect example of correctly identifying through identifying against.
It's like
Manuel, you said previously how the loss is a consequence, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not sort of a thing itself. I think you can view loss as a kind of verb, and it's the movement from the state of life in homeland to the exile. And so I think this also relates back to the idea of that one tiny exemplification as sort of a seed that spreads out. Is that in taking, for example, the apple from the tree, the fruit from the tree, it's a mini microcosm exemplification of that loss of the exile, which is that you are severing the heaven from the earth. You're participating in an action. You're manifesting an action that doesn't have that purpose in alignment with what it should be, and that's that micro seed that then spreads out, and it manifests, and then you end up in exile.
Right, and that's the creation of a new space as well, right? Like I think that's maybe right. Like if you go back to the orbiting thing, right? So if you lose the connection, like a new balance needs to be established, right? So then you have to adopt a new orbit, right? And that orbit can still hold true to the principle, or it can go to other gods, right? It can go worship another principle.
Yeah, it's like the tree equivalent of an ex-wife or something.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, that is. Yes. But like, yeah. So the interesting thing is that that's described as a mountain, and I'm like, yeah, just I don't know. Yeah. So if we increase the space, right, we increase the things that are within that space, so that means that there's more that needs to be accounted for, right, and that new equilibrium needs to account for those things. Are we good with this page? So I had, well, we can pause it here too. Maybe we should wrap it up. Get back to this page. Um, yeah. Does anybody have some last thoughts and maybe some framing for reflection?
I think if I could just offer as I guess just since we were just there on the previous or on this page, that just that aspect of it of the axle of time or the sort of the bad space being just the absence of a manifest connection between heaven and earth, not as necessarily like its own like angry evil tree or something like that, but just as like, oh, by not having it, here's this thing that would normally be really good, but then there's a sort of either like a judgment that's incurred as a result of reaching for it or no longer having a connection to it.
Yeah. Okay. So I like that, right? So if there's an absence of a manifest connection, right? Like the flow is frustrated, so they can go back to my intention. Um, so I guess that would be a good frame for reflection, right? Like how would that manifest in our lives, the absence of a manifest connection, and how do we relate to that, and like maybe related to the book club as well. Okay. Who wants to share their insights?
I'll just try to jump in here. I mean, I've got so much to say. I mean, the deep thoughts on self-fractal patterns, it's a very grand topic. One thing I was thinking about in this section, in my opinion, this section of the book is kind of a climax. I was sort of thinking about my relationship with the Republic Book Club and the end, and my grand take on the Republic at the end. It's this vision of a reincarnation, and Plato builds this realm of, or this argument for immortality, and there's this idea that actions echo into eternity. So I was sort of thinking about that while reading this part of the book, not just like, and how the world, not just in, how your DNA and things get encoded to you, but how the world manifests itself to you. Lately, there have been some actions that I've undertaken, like from a position of faith, and then all kinds of these bizarre, experiences have happened and everything. And so, Manuel mentioned, leaps of faith. Sometimes, you have to pull the trigger on something, and then you gain the strength. And it's not until you actually take the act, like you can't just, fool yourself into changing your motivations and gain, like using God like a slot machine or something like that. So there's a relationship between faith and the action, like the perspectival transformations that happen with practices that you do, things that you repeat. I think ultimately, like how I see, I connect this with the individual experiences, that it matters because it matters how you see the potential in the world of what the world could be. Like it's an important question in seeing the opportunity in the world as you walk through it. Because so anyway, that was kind of some grand high level stuff. I know that maybe sounded kind of abstract, but I guess what I was sort of connecting some of the themes that I saw in the chapter with connecting this back to the idea of being in flow. I mean, I could talk all day long about this because it's more of a lower level thing. Um, but I'm happy to talk about it. I just don't know if I consume too much time or if it's interesting. But those are some high level thoughts on these chapters. I'll leave it for a response for now.
I mean, I'd be open to hearing more.
Okay, let's finish hold on. Let's finish our reflections first, and then we can do it off stream.
Sure.
I guess if I could add, just with respect to this sort of the tree becoming kind of like a judge, or being, becoming the pillar of death, as opposed to how it was. I used the silly example of kind of the ex-wife, but there is something to that, and also this aspect of like burning bridges. So you have this sort of overextension of light, in a sense, when you kind of burn a bridge, and a lot of times and we're going to be, I won't kind of overextend into the next chapter because that'll be next week, but there is this aspect of overextending when you look at how bridges are burned. A lot of times it's something to do with ambition. So some sort of thing of, a person looking in one sense higher than their station, but also not high enough. So there is that aspect of like, oh, we're going to be like gods, or I'm going to be, a professional whatever, or I'm going to, make so much money doing this by stealing that diamond from the vault or whatever, and then you end up at death and exile, or a nice way of saying it is life in prison, but it's the same thing. Or there's the sort of the burning bridges aspect of, I would normally, maybe you could upgrade from one office position to something better, but then you go and in your ambition you speedily go and ruin all of your connections to the other people to be ambitious and get that other position, and now they're not going to recommend you if someone calls and checks on your history, or something like that. That there's this aspect of the higher thing but not the highest thing winding up sort of betraying you, or no longer being a place of stability, and you can never go back, and there is that aspect to that.
So I try to imagine, right, like what is the position of being severed, right, from heaven, or from the tree of life, or and it's a position of not knowing, right? So it's like there's a lack of identity. Domicide would be a word to use there. Also a lack of partaking, right? So you don't know how to be part, to partake, to commune. All of these things they fall away, because and so you end up being cut off, right? Like you're lost, and you end up upset, right? Because as a consequence of the lack of externality constraining or informing or calling you, maybe that's a better word, right? It's calling you out of yourself. Your inner self gets upset, because it's dysregulated. Um, and then a couple things that uh, came out of that is like, how do we give expression to the upsetness, right? So that like that frustration needs to be channeled in a manner. So what's the imperative there? And Daniel said like, fate, right? Like what's the relationship of that imperative to fate? And the last thing is like when others are in this state, right? Like how do you reach out? Like how can you give a hand, um, or a lifeline? Maybe that's a better word there. Is everybody else complete?
I think I was gonna say, in relation to what you were just saying, Manuel, what you're severed from really is like being informed from above. That was the things like in the relationship between heaven and earth they went over is like, heaven, comes down and informs the matter, and then you refine the matter, lifting it up. That's the informing from heaven kind of has to happen first, because that's what tells you how to refine the matter. When you're doing that, that's you can see like, you need to clean your room here, but you need to know like what you're cleaning your room for, sort of, before you do it.
Yeah, and what a clean room looks like as well, right? Like, so yeah, so everybody, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week, and we will reconnect.